He had been taught that capture was the end of everything. Not the end of the war, not the end of fighting, the end of the self. From the first days of military training, the message had been woven into everything, into drills, into lectures, into the silences between orders, when the meaning of what was expected settled into the bones of young men who had never questioned whether it was true. Surrender was not an option. Surrender was not a misfortune. Surrender was an erasure. A man who allowed himself to be taken prisoner had already ceased to exist in any way that counted. He had believed this completely. He believed it through the weeks of fighting that preceded his capture, through the bombardment that had no end, through the days when food stopped arriving and water became something people argued over in whispers. He believed it when the unit around him collapsed, not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly, person by person, until what had been a cohesive fighting force became a scattered collection of exhausted individuals moving through jungle and rock with no clear purpose except to continue, because continuing was the only thing left. He believed it until the moment an American soldier handed him a cigarette. The Pacific War produced a prisoner of war situation unlike almost any other theatre of the conflict. Japanese forces surrendered in small numbers and late in the war, and the reasons were not simply tactical, they were cultural, institutional, doctrinal. The Japanese military code treated surrender as a form of death, or worse than death, a dishonour that contaminated not just the individual, but the family, the community, the entire chain of obligation that defined a person's place in the world. Men were expected to die rather than be taken. Many did. The ones who didn't, who through injury or unconsciousness, or the simple, overwhelming weight of circumstances found themselves in American hands, emerged into captivity, carrying assumptions about what would happen next that shaped every early interaction with their captors. Those assumptions were almost uniformly wrong. The soldier's name, as it appears in the limited post-war documentation available, was Kenji. He was 22 years old. He had been a student before conscription, studying agricultural science at a small university in central Japan. He had a younger sister and an older brother who had already been killed in China 2 years before Kenji was sent to the Pacific. He had been unconscious when he was found. A combination of dehydration, untreated wounds, and a fever that had been building for days without medication finally took him down in a ravine somewhere on the island's interior. He did not experience capture as an event, he experienced it as an absence, a gap between one moment and another. And then he was somewhere else, lying on something that was not rock or mud, looking up at a canvas ceiling, and there was a person nearby who was American and who was doing something to his arm. The American was a medic. He was cleaning and bandaging a wound on Kenji's forearm that had become infected. He was doing this with the focused, impersonal efficiency of someone performing a task they had performed many times, without anger, without hesitation, without the deliberate roughness that Kenji had been told to expect. When Kenji's eyes opened and found him, the medic looked up, registered that his patient was conscious, and said something in English that Kenji did not understand. An interpreter arrived minutes later, Japanese-American, a Nisei soldier from California, whose presence Kenji found deeply disorienting. The interpreter explained in Japanese that Kenji was in an American medical facility, that his wounds were being treated, that he would be moved to a holding facility when stable, that he would be treated according to the rules of war. Kenji said he understood the words. He said he did not understand why. The interpreter translated this. The medic looked at Kenji for a moment, then returned to the bandage. He finished it, checked the tension, made a small adjustment. Then he reached into his kit and produced a cigarette and held it out toward Kenji with the straightforward gesture of someone offering a small thing that costs nothing. Kenji did not take it immediately. He looked at the cigarette. He looked at the medic. He was conducting a rapid internal assessment that drew on everything he had been taught and found none of it adequate to explain what was in front of him. An enemy soldier was offering him a cigarette. His wound had been cleaned and bandaged. No one had struck him. No one had shouted. The interpreter was speaking to him in his own language, as though his responses were expected to matter. He took the cigarette. The medic produced a lighter and lit it. Kenji smoked in silence, staring at the canvas ceiling. Later, Kenji would describe this moment as the one in which the war changed for him. Not ended, changed. He said the cigarette itself meant very little. What the cigarette meant was the hand that offered it. The absence of contempt in that hand. The ordinary, unremarkable way it was extended, as though offering a cigarette to a Japanese prisoner were a normal thing to do, as natural as offering one to any person sitting nearby who might want one. He had not been prepared for normalcy. The holding facility to which Kenji was transferred was a temporary camp holding several dozen Japanese prisoners of various backgrounds and conditions. It was not comfortable in any luxurious sense. Food was better than what the men had had in the field, but not generous. Shelter was sufficient, but not insulated against the heat. Medical care was better than many of them had received in the Japanese military system, where the treatment of ordinary soldiers had historically ranked well below the treatment of equipment and officers. What it was, consistently, was what it said it would be. Meals arrived when they were said to arrive. Rules were explained rather than simply enforced by force. Questions received answers. Medical examinations happened on schedule. The guards varied in temperament, as guards anywhere vary, but the variation operated within a range that did not include arbitrary violence. It told the prisoners something important about the environment they were in. It told them that the environment had a flaw. For men who had operated for years in a system where the flaw did not reliably exist, this was profoundly disorienting. One of the other prisoners, a man named Taro who had been a postal worker in Osaka before conscription, described in a post-war interview watching an American guard help an injured prisoner walk to the medical tent, not because the guard was ordered to, not because anyone was watching, but simply because the prisoner was struggling and the guard was nearby. Taro said he stood and watched and felt something he did not have a precise word for, something between confusion and grief. The help was being offered to someone who was an enemy of the man offering it, and the man offering it did not appear to find this contradictory. He said that in his experience, help moved along the lines of obligation and relationship. You helped people you were connected to, people you owed something to. You did not help enemies. The categories were clear, and the clarity served a function. It made everything that needed to happen in war possible, without the friction of inconvenient human recognition. The guard had not appeared to be using categories. Back in the facility, another kind of moment unfolded. An American officer who spoke some Japanese had taken on an informal role as a secondary interpreter, not official, simply a man who had studied the language before the war out of personal curiosity. On some evenings he was available to talk. He asked questions about Japan, about the places the prisoners came from, about food, about family, about agricultural techniques in different regions. He asked with the focused, genuine interest of someone who actually wanted the answers, not to extract intelligence, but because the answers were interesting to him. Kenji, whose agricultural background gave him common ground with some of the officer's questions, found himself answering before he had made a conscious decision to answer. The officer asked about rice cultivation in Kenji's home region, about specific varieties grown there, about the relationship between soil type and yield that Kenji had been studying before the war pulled him away. Kenji answered in more detail than the question required, because the question was about something he actually knew and actually cared about, and had not been asked to think about in more than 2 years. When he stopped talking, the officer said he hoped, when the war was over, Kenji would be able to go back to his studies, that the work sounded important, that feeding people was important work. Kenji sat with this for a long time after the conversation ended. He had been taught that Americans were a specific kind of enemy, not just militarily, but morally. This characterization had been built carefully because it served the war, because it made the fighting easier and the dying easier, and the willingness to die, rather than surrender, easier. The categories held the whole structure together. An officer who hoped Kenji would return to his agricultural studies did not fit those categories. This did not resolve anything. It did not erase the war or what the war had cost. It did not address the brother killed in China or the mother at home. It simply sat there, alongside everything else, as evidence that the world was more complicated than the training had allowed for. Kenji was repatriated to Japan in late 1945. He returned to a country still working out what it was becoming. He did not speak for a long time about his time in American custody. There was no framework in post-war Japan, in those first raw years, for the experience of a man who had been taken prisoner and treated with something resembling decency. So he was quiet about it. He finished his degree when the universities reopened. He worked for many years in agricultural research, the work of feeding people, and he was good at it. In his later years, after Japan had rebuilt and the war had become something that could be examined from a distance, he spoke occasionally to younger people about what he had experienced. He said that the hardest thing to explain was not the fighting or the fear or the loss. Those things had their own language and people understood them well enough. The hardest thing to explain was the cigarette. Not because the cigarette was important. He was always clear about that. The cigarette was a small thing, worth almost nothing. The hardest thing to explain was that it had been offered at all. That in a moment where everything he had been taught said he had forfeited the right to ordinary human consideration, a man he had never met had looked at him and made the simple human calculation that he might want a cigarette, and had held one out. He said that calculation had taken something apart in him that he spent years trying to understand. Not repair, understand. Because it meant the categories were not as solid as he had been taught. It meant that an enemy could make a gesture so small it barely registered, and in doing so, complicate everything a person thought they knew about what they were fighting and why. He said he was never entirely sure, after all those years, whether that was a comfort or a grief. He said perhaps it was both, and perhaps that was the most honest thing he could offer anyone trying to understand what the war had actually been. Not in its movements and strategies and outcomes, but in the small spaces between those things, where people assigned to opposite sides of a line encountered each other as people and had to decide what to do with that. Kenji died in 1998. His daughter, sorting through his belongings, found a small notebook kept sporadically over the years. Near the front, in handwriting younger and less settled than the rest, was a single entry from the late 1940s. It said approximately this: I was told we were not the kind of people they would offer anything to. I think about what it means that they were wrong about us, and we were wrong about them, and the war happened anyway, between people who were capable of offering cigarettes and receiving them, and neither side knew that about the other until it was almost too late. Perhaps that is what wars are. Perhaps they are what happens in the space before people find out. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing so these moments don't disappear. Like the video so it reaches more people, and leave a comment below. We read every one.